We've been away, I guess, a couple of weeks from our kind of through the Bible type of time in Luke. Although Easter, we were in Luke, but we had jumped forward to the end, and we will actually get there again. So it's going to be kind of like, oh, how am I going to do that? But we'll get to it. We'll be fine. And then obviously Pastor Chris was here last week sharing, so we get back into the book of Luke, and jumping into our time together. Up until this point, kind of give you a fresher minds where we've been. Jesus has been teaching throughout the area in the region of Galilee, going around in a circuit through the different towns. He's been gaining popularity. He's been getting noticed by the religious leaders. We've been seeing those guys, those pesky religious leaders, following Jesus around, and we'll see him again as we move forward more and more. And he's gaining a following, right? He's gaining a group of disciples. And up until this point, these people that have been following have been just all disciples. They've just been kind of all the same, so to speak. But this is about to change. And in our text that we're going to look at this evening, we're going to see that Luke records the promotion, if you will, of the 12, what we would call the 12 apostles. And these men, of course, with the exception of Judas Iscariot, would actually end up becoming, as we know, and we'll see, obviously, we see in the book of Acts, eventually they'll become the leaders of this newly formed thing called the church, the body of Christ. And so Jesus, in a very real sense, is taking his ministry to another level. He's been teaching, he's been doing miracles, but now, and he's got following disciples. Now he's going to start bringing these men up, calling them up to become something that they didn't have before. Leaders in the church, choosing them to be what we would call apostles. So they're 12. Now, before we jump into our text, someone might say, well, why 12, right? Why not 10? Why not 8? Why not 15 or 20? Most scholars surmise that 12 kind of corresponds with the idea of the 12 tribes in Israel. The 12 tribes kind of represent the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the law, so on. And then the 12 apostles, they represent the new covenant that Jesus is establishing through his ministry and through his death and resurrection. You see even this in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 21, both are represented. The gates around the New Jerusalem are inscribed with the 12 tribes of Israel, whereas the foundation of the New Jerusalem, there's layers in the foundation, they're inscribed with the names of the 12 apostles. So they're represented, both the old and the new. Beyond that, spiritually speaking, Ephesians 2:20 says that we have been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. So there's a foundation of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's not just all about the new, because the Old Testament is there for us. It's a foundation for us, and it really is a foreshadowing of the new. So they're both there. They both are represented. So we'll look at these men, and now some of these men, when we look at them, the individuals, we've got a little bit more information. Some of them we want just a small amount of information, and some we pretty much have no information other than their names being listed in the list. So we'll talk about them, and we're going to touch upon some of the extra biblical, historical kind of information that's out there about them. So we're calling this the 12. It's simple enough, right? The 12, and we're going to be in Luke chapter 6, if you haven't turned there already, and appropriately enough, we're going to be starting in verse 12. There you go. So verse 12, it says, now it came to pass in those days that he went out on the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. Now that he is, of course, Jesus. We'll stop there. So Jesus, on the eve, if you will, of making this very, very important decision. It tells us what he does. He goes off to pray. That's very important. That's critical for us. I mean, and his prayer, as we will see, as it states already, it wasn't just like, a few minutes of prayer before bed, or like, oh, I'm going to pray for my meal. I'll throw in a little prayer for something, about this. No. This was much, much more than that. First of all, it tells us that he went out to the mountain to pray. In other words, he got away. He got away from all the usual distractions, the potential distractions. Isn't that how often it is? We go to pray, or we go to want to spend time, and then the phone rings, or people come and ask us something, or something breaks, or something happens. There's always just something. And so it's very good advice, very important, especially if we have something that's important in our lives, like something that's very critical, that's ahead of us, that we need to pray for, right? That we have something that's about to happen, decisions that we need to make, and we should be praying about that, getting away, removing all the distractions, if you will. In fact, it should just be a part of our daily devotional life. It should be, I think of what Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, where he says, the Father, he uses this phrase, the Father who sees you in secret, who sees in secret. He's talking about kind of getting away. He's talking about having that, what we might call it a prayer closet, right? Finding that time to get away and just from all the distractions, to be, in tune with God. Now, having said that, this isn't saying that public prayer or prayer with a group of individuals isn't important either. In fact, I think it's very important. In fact, this morning in Dunfermline, we were talking about that. We're talking about how they came together to pray for boldness, and it was the whole group of them, and how important that was to gather together. But the truth is, when we see Jesus getting alone with God, first we need to understand that God is jealous for us. He really desires and wants to spend uninterrupted time with us. I mean, think about it. He's our Father. We're his children. Wouldn't you want that? I mean, I think about my son, and I want to spend, hey, let's go do this one thing, and we do it together. We get to have father-son time, so to speak. It sounds like, no, I don't know about that anymore much, but that's what God wants with us. He wants father-child time. He wants that with us. And we need it. We need it to hear from the Lord clearly. And so Jesus, he gets away, right? He goes up on the mountain. And then it says he continued all night in prayer to God. Now, before I get into this, there's nothing wrong with throwing out, if needs be, those what we call those arrow prayers. Those times when you just like, oh God, help me in this unexpected moment. I'm dealing with this thing. That's great. That's nothing wrong with that. But the truth is, if you think about it, if we're honest with ourselves, the truth is most things that we are praying about are not things that happen to us unexpected. They're things that are happening ongoing in our lives. They're things that we know about. We have time. We're dealing with them, right? And so there's literally then nothing stopping us from then getting away, spending some extended amount of time in prayer with the Lord about that circumstance, about that situation. And that's what God really calls us to do. And if you really think about the instructions that have been given to us about prayer in the Bible, almost all of it has to do with longevity of prayer, like persevering in prayer, taking time in prayer. It's not about just praying once and then it just kind of expectation. Think about when Jesus gave the analogy for prayer with the persistent widow, the parable of the persistent widow, talking about the unrighteous judge. She just kept coming, and so on and so forth. Or when he talked about prayer and he said, ask and seek and knock. Those terms, the verbs, in the original language, ask, seek, and knock are what's called in what's called the present continuous tense. In other words, if you were to understand the original language, it means keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. Right? There's an idea of perseverance, longevity. Now, why is that so? It's not as if God is holding back the answers until you have just done enough to warrant me God giving you the answers. That is not the case. That is not why we need to be persistent. In fact, the persistence that the Bible teaches about in prayer is for our own benefit. It's for us so that way we then can spend time drawing closer and closer and closer to the Lord. Right? In fact, think about Jesus. Jesus is one with the Father. So his praying all night wasn't some sort of test by the Father to see if whether or not he could pray long enough to hear the answer. The reason why Jesus spent all night is because he understood how important this decision, these choices that he was going to make, how important they were, not just for him, not just for his ministry, but for the rest of the church history. How important it was for the people, the men he was going to choose, that he needed to be perfectly connected and in tune with the Father. So that was important. So that's what we see Jesus doing here. And he did that all night. And then verse 13, it says, when it was day, so he had finished praying, and now it's time to make this the call itself, if you will. He called his disciples to himself, so all the people, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. So out of all the disciples, he chooses these 12 men to be apostles. I mean, maybe they didn't know what was coming. I mean, I'm sure they probably didn't have any idea like what was coming. Like, oh, what is that? The word apostle, it's like we use those in terms, and we'll talk about apostle, but it really just it's a Greek word apostolos, and it means simply sent out ones. Sent out ones. A lot of times we think of it as apostle, capital A, Of course, generally speaking, when it comes to what I think of the apostles, capital A, most scholars, not all, but most scholars would say that that office of capital A apostles has been complete. In other words, one of the criteria to be a capital A apostle is to have seen the risen Lord firsthand, personally. So that's the 12, and we would include Paul in that as being an apostle. But here's the thing. That's capital A, big A, right? But apostle small a, there's a difference. I think there's a lot of ways we can look at somebody as being an apostle. Individuals within the church that maybe are like in the governing kind of body of the church. They oversee not just one church, but they oversee maybe multiple churches. You might call them or consider them in that office of apostle, small a. Or even, in fact, if the term apostle means sent out ones, missionaries could be construed as being apostles or modern day apostles. They are certainly ones who are sent out. They are certainly ones then who plant churches or facilitate church plants and seeing bodies of believers organized, right? And then if you take it even further, in even more general sense, in a very spiritual sense, we are all apostles because we have been sent out into this world to share our faith, to preach the gospel, to be a light in this world that we live in for the gospel's sake. So you think about Jesus, think about this. He chose those 12, right? But in the very same way, he chose us. He chose each one of us. And in the way he was praying for them, Hebrews 7:25 says that he ever lives to intercede for us. So he was praying, and he continues to pray for us as well. So just like those 12 who he prayed for and he sent out, He's prayed for us, and he's sent us out too. So we can look at ourselves as one that are sent out, that are small a apostle. Now, we're called to serve him. We're called to live for him. And listen, that call that we have to understand it's on all of our lives, whether you realize it or not. The call actually is not dependent upon you realizing it, to be honest with you, and it's even not even dependent upon you answering it, being obedient to the call. The call is there. If you become a believer, you have been called. Period. Right? Now, of course, God does desire. He does desire for us to answer, to follow and become one who willingly feel that we're sent out. That's our role in this world. Whether it's just to your workplace or wherever it might be, you're used by God as one that's sent out into this world. Now, back to our story. In the next few verses, then Luke lists the 12 that he chooses. And so we're going to read them, and then we're going to talk about them. It says, Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. Now, again, some of them will have more information, some less, some not even any at all. But we'll kind of see what we can see about each one of them. So we're going to kind of look at each one in the order here as they're listed. So first it's Simon. Now, before we get to Simon, just as a side note, you kind of notice they tend to be listed somewhat in pairs. I don't know if that's even noticeable to you. Peter, then Andrew, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew. So there's kind of pairing going on. Now that may be just coincidental that that's the way Luke listed them, and maybe that's the way the Lord sent them out, because he did send them out in twos. So maybe these guys were connected in that way as he sent them out. We're not told. But anyway, so first up is Simon. And of course, we know who Simon is. It says, who was also named Peter. And Peter, of course, you know that's the story. It was the nickname that Jesus gave him. The word Peter means stone or small rock. So he basically nicknamed him Rocky. Yo, Rock, And of course, we know somewhat. There's a lot in the Gospels and even in the book of Acts about Peter. He's a focal point. And we know some things about him, right? That he was in his, BC days, if you will, or before God really started refining him. He was kind of a brash guy. Even during the ministry of Jesus, he was kind of brash, headstrong, blunt. I mean, he definitely was a leader. God chose this man. Obviously, he had leadership because other people just followed him. Other people, he was just probably maybe because he was the loudest guy in the room, and so hey, he must know something, I guess. And he had what maybe you've heard this expression before. What they would call a terrible case of foot and mouth disease. That he would speak so often before he would think. I think of the fact that when Jesus gave him the name Peter or Rocky, it was because Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am?" And he's like, "You're the Christ, the Son of God." And it's like heaven, Spirit of God to reveal that to you. I'm going to name you Peter now. And so on. But within the next breath of the commentary, basically Jesus is telling them, "I'm going to go to the cross," and then Peter pulls him aside. His first act as officially Peter, and he says, "No, Lord, you're not going to go." And Jesus has to say, "Get behind me, Satan." You're not mindful of the things of the Lord. So it's like Peter just speaks just brashly and hard. That's the kind of person he was. And then I think of the other time about Peter when they were on the Mount of Transfiguration, right? And it was amazing, right? All this stuff. Elijah, Moses was there, and Peter is just going on and on. He's going like, oh Lord, it's so good to be up here. Let's build 3 tabernacles, and you can one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. It's like you could just hear him. I can't stop myself. It's just words coming out, And it's so I just think the moment is actually kind of hilarious to me. But all of a sudden the cloud kind of moves in, and God's Father speaks from above, like, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." I only have to think that God was telling Peter, "Peter, shut up and listen to Jesus. Stop blethering on," kind of a thing, So that was Peter, and he had so many, I think guys can kind of relate to Peter somewhat, I think, because he's had so many rough edges, and yet God chose Peter. And you think about Peter once filled with the Holy Spirit. Wow. What a spiritual dynamo. He, on the day of Pentecost, he arose, those first moments of the church, and he preached the church's first sermon. And it tells us 5,000 souls were added that day. Imagine, that's like Billy Graham style preaching, right? And then another sermon he preached in the temple, and 3,000 souls were added. And God also then used Peter as well to take the gospel to Cornelius and his family, and they were saved. In other words, God used Peter to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. So Peter was used mightily, and that gives us comfort, that we may be rough around the edges, but God can work in us. God can refine us. God can chip away some of those edges. And even in spite, maybe we have some rough edges still, that God can still use us, right? As he did Peter. Now, history tells us that Peter then would be later crucified in AD 66. And it tells us that he didn't feel worthy to be crucified in the same way as his Lord, so he was crucified upside down. So that's Peter. We move on to Andrew. Andrew, of course, is his brother. It tells us Andrew, his brother. Now, I'm assuming, and everybody assumes, and I just trust that it's the case, but that he was his younger brother. But it doesn't necessarily ever say younger brother, but I'm assuming it is younger, although he may have been older. He definitely was not as well known and wasn't probably as loud or boisterous as Peter was. And there's not a whole lot that we know about him, but what we do know about Andrew is awesome and is commendable. In fact, Andrew, if you look at all the incidences of Andrew in the Gospels, is known for always bringing people to Jesus. Bringing people. In fact, John 1:39, it tells us that he is the one who brought Peter to Jesus. So Andrew is the one that introduced Peter to Jesus in the first place. And then in John 6, when Jesus wanted to feed the multitudes, right, the 5,000, he's like, well, we got food, and it was the little boy's lunch that they used, the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and it was Andrew that brought the little boy to Jesus. And then in John chapter 12, there was a group of Gentiles that wanted to meet Jesus. They just said, okay, we heard about this guy, and we want to meet him. It was Andrew who brought the Gentile group to meet Jesus. So he's always bringing. Now, I thought about that. I thought, man, that is a great example for us. Wouldn't to God that we, too, would be like Andrew, always wanted to bring people to Jesus, right? Have you met my Lord? Have you met my Savior Jesus? I want to come along, Maybe inviting them to come to the church, to this Bible study, or just talking about Jesus, just introducing to him, as you have conversation. So that's Andrew. What a great example he was. And of course, kind of another note, Andrew, along with Peter and James and John, would have been kind of considered an inner core. So there was oftentimes where just the 4 of them would be brought along with Jesus. And at the same time, there was actually something called like an inner circle, if you will, that Andrew was not a part of. It would have been just Peter and then James and John. But anyway, history tells us that Andrew went into some of the areas of what would be the western portions of the old former Soviet Union, that he went into some of those countries, northern as well as northern Turkey, so he got around, and then as well, lastly, into Greece. And it was said that he was crucified there in Greece, although I couldn't find a specific date, a time that he was. But so Andrew, James, we get to the brothers here, James and John. We'll talk about John in a second. They were brothers, of course, and they had a reputation as well. They were kind of fiery and feisty kind of guys as well. Jesus himself gave them the nickname Boanerges, Sons of Thunder, the Thunder Boys, right? These guys were like, you could have been seen them as like the tag team wrestlers, the Nacho Libre or something like that. Anyway, and they were brash. In fact, they were kind of brazen on a couple of occasions. One specifically, they came up to Jesus. This was James and John. And they basically said, "Hey, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, can you give us the best seats, the seats of honor on your left and on your right when you come into your kingdom, And wow, brazen. In fact, that was Mark's account. Matthew's account says on another occasion they sent their mother, to go and ask the same question. So I think you might have the expression they had some cheek, The other apostles and disciples kind of were a little bit like, "Hey, what's up with that?" And it's because they beat him to the punch, kind of a thing, So brash moments, and we're not actually told a whole lot more about James, other than the fact that he was inner circle with John and with Peter. Now, as far as his life, we don't have to go to any extra biblical history to tell us how he died or what happened to him, because we have it in Acts 12. And it tells us that he was killed by the sword by Herod, which then would make him the first apostle then of the group of 12 to be martyred. Now, when they asked Jesus about having the honored seats, Jesus asked him that question: "Can you drink the cup that I would drink from?" Right? He asked them that, and of course, they're like, "Yes, we can, of course." Not fully really understanding what that even meant, and yet James did. He did drink. He drank from the cup, that same cup, that cup of persecution and martyrdom, as Jesus predicted. And so, when I think of James, I think of myself as when I ask that question: Am I willing? Am I willing to drink from that cup? Am I willing to face persecution, maybe even martyrdom? Am I willing to face that? If it's just social or if it's just verbal persecution. So that's James. And of course, then we have his brother John, right? Again, as well, these two, James and John, were partners with Peter and Andrew in the fishing business. So they were, they were rough guys, fishermen out there just doing the hard labor. And well, they were as well. He was one of the Thunder Boys, and in fact, Jesus called them that name, Boanerges, after there was a moment where they came to Jesus because these other people were preaching and talking about Jesus, but they weren't part of his group, and they're like, "You want us to call down fire from heaven?" To make them crispy critters, so to speak, to fry them. And he's like, "You don't know what kind of a spirit you are." And he gave them that nickname. So they were very brash and harsh men, John especially. But yet, think about this. When we think about John, we don't think of him like that. We think of him as the apostle of love. Right? He's the apostle of love. So what happened? Right? He spent time with Jesus. He spent time with Jesus, and he was transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. In fact, God, of course, used him. Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Revelation. But in the Gospels, he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, some people say, well, man, that's kind of a braggadocious, like, I'm the disciple that Jesus loved. That wasn't what it was at all. Not at all. In fact, it wasn't pride. It was incredulity. He was like saying, can you believe it? Me. You know me. Those that know me know me of all people. I'm the disciple that Jesus loved. That kind of a attitude. Okay, so that's John. I mean, he was the inner circle. So that means that he was there. He spent time with Jesus. He was there on the Mount of Transfiguration. He was there. Think about this. He was there at the foot of the cross. The only apostle to actually stick around and stay with Jesus all the way to the end on the cross. In fact, Jesus said, John, here's Mary, my mother, take care of her. Right? He was given that honor, that blessing. And so when you read John's writings, when you read the epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, they exude love. And it's the theme that runs through all of his books. And that's because God is love. And just as I said, when John and when we spend time with Jesus, we're going to have that love just oozing out of our hearts and lives. Any length of time, we're going to reflect the love of God. And I think of what he wrote, 1 John 4:7. He says, Beloved, let us love one another. For love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. So that's John. John is love, man, just personified. He did have a unique history, though. History tells us that he became the pastor for a while, period, at the church of Ephesus. So that was him there. Later, he was taken into prison, taken into a captive as a prisoner under Domitian, the emperor, and he was exiled to the island of Patmos. And of course, we know that on the island of Patmos, he received the vision of the book of Revelation. Tradition also talks about how they tried to boil him in oil, and it didn't work. So you could basically say he was like the asbestos apostle, or maybe he was the Teflon apostle. I don't know. And then there's actually tradition that says that he escaped at some point, but we know he did die basically of old age. So he was the only apostle to not be martyred. So interestingly enough. All right, let's move on. We get to Philip. And the rest of some of these we don't have as much information about, so it won't take as long to talk about them. But now Philip, the only place that we're given any background actually is in the Gospel of John. And we see Philip finding Nathanael and then telling him about Jesus. And it also tells us that he is from the area, and implying the same region as Peter and Andrew, implying that they were all friends, that they all knew each other, right? So it was likely that he was friends with Andrew. That would be very kind of interesting, and it would stand to reason why he too was a person that would bring people to Jesus, right? He brought Nathanael to Jesus. In fact, the other place that we have a little bit of information, just his name mentioned, when I mentioned that Gentile group that wanted to see Jesus. Originally, when those group came, they came to Philip first. And then Philip kind of said, well, let's go. And then he found Andrew. And then Andrew then took all of them to see Jesus. Right? So maybe Philip was like, I'm a little not as bold as Andrew was, And I know Andrew's kind of like somewhat in the inner circle. So I'll take him to Andrew first, and then we'll go find Jesus. So that's Philip. Now, Philip, the history tells us that he went on to minister in northern Africa. So that's cool. I mean, you see these guys that went really so far into the known world. Later, he was back in Asia Minor, where it is said that he actually converted the wife of the Roman proconsul, which is like the area kind of governor, and he wasn't too happy with that, this governor, and in retaliation, he had him executed. So there you go. That's Philip. And then it says, the next one, Philip and Bartholomew. Now, there's not many places that even talks about Bartholomew, but what's interesting and what most scholars believe is that Bartholomew is the same person as Nathanael in the Gospel of John. because John's gospel doesn't mention anything about Bartholomew, and the rest of the gospels mention Bartholomew, but nothing about Nathaniel. And Philip and Nathaniel, or Bartholomew, are connected here in this list, right? So that would explain why they're there. So, anyway, again, not much is spoken about either of the two guys. The only mention in Nathaniel is actually in the Gospel of John, after Jesus died and rose again, and later on Peter and them were like, I'm going fishing, It says a group of them said, yeah, we'll go with you, and he was one of them. That was pretty much all the information it has about him. History does tell us that Bartholomew / Nathaniel did have a ministry in India, Armenia, Ethiopia. Again, he got around, and southern Arabia, where and then his details. He was martyred, but they're not exact. And then we move on to Matthew. Now we know a little bit more about Matthew because we just studied him, right? He was a tax collector. He gave up all. He was an outcast. He would have been considered an outcast by society, because even a traitor by society, by his own Jewish people, because of the job he had and working for the Romans. And yet he gave up so much to follow Jesus, right? So we can see that God can reach it, even someone who feels like they're an outcast, even someone that the world that says you're a traitor. God can reach out to a person like that and bring them into the kingdom. So that's Matthew. But history tells us that, of course, he wrote the Gospel of Matthew. So that's awesome. God used him to do that. But he brought the gospel to Persia and then to Ethiopia. And reports say that he was stabbed to death while in Ethiopia. There you go. Next on the list is Thomas. And, of course, he was nicknamed Didymus, which means twin. So he was obviously a twin. Now, we're not told whether Thomas's twin brother followed Jesus as well. We're not told about that. But we know who Thomas is, right? Because everybody knows Thomas, Doubting Thomas. So he's been given that nickname for centuries, Doubting Thomas. And that was given to him, right? Remember when he was Jesus appeared to the disciples and the apostles in the upper room, and he wasn't in the room. And so then when they told him about it, he says in John 20:25, he says, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger in the print of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. Now, so it's like people say, oh, he's doubting. Of course, we know Jesus appears to him later, and he says, go ahead, Thomas, feel the nail prints, feel the side. I love what his response, because it tells us Thomas didn't even touch the hand or touch the side. Before he ever even did that, he just said, my Lord and my God, right? Now, there were a couple other moments that kind of built up Thomas's reputation. John 11:16, it says, Jesus was telling the disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem to die. He was giving them that forewarning. And then Thomas basically says, well, let us go, that we may die with him. So, when they say Doubting Thomas and they give him that reputation that he was a doubter, I tend to think that that's not really what Thomas was all about. I think that Thomas was more of a pragmatist, right? He was more of a kind of a person that said, well, unless I see it, unless I touch it, unless I have the evidence in front of me, I am not going to really believe. I'm not going to believe. You can't convince me otherwise. That's not a doubter. That's just somebody that's kind of like a pragmatist. They have to see it. I know people that are pragmatists in a lot of ways, right? And yet Jesus told Thomas, after that moment when he said, my Lord and my God, he says, because you have seen me, you have believed. But he says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Right? That's you and I. We've never seen Jesus physically, and yet we've believed in him. Right? Faith is about believing. We walk by faith, not by sight. I think, in fact, it's interesting because some people say, well, let me see and I'll believe. But I think if we believed, then we would see. Right? Sight will follow belief. It's interesting, right? The more we believe, the more we understand. And we can say, yeah, that makes sense to me. I see the things of the scriptures. That makes perfect sense. It's because we've applied faith, we've applied belief to our worldview. And I think Thomas serves as a great example of how God can reach even the most pragmatic person in life. Now, Thomas as well went on with Bartholomew actually to India, went on to India, and it's said that Thomas established a group of believers called the Marthoma Christians, and they're still in existence today. And they still claim Thomas, the apostle, as their founder. So that's pretty cool that you have a group of people that are in existence because of the work that you did thousands of years later. That's pretty awesome. They claim that he died by being speared by 4 soldiers. There you go. All right, so the next few guys, not as much about, we'll go through them fairly quickly. James, the son of Alphaeus, or Alphaeus. He's also known as James the Less. So maybe he was small, diminutive guy, or maybe they didn't see him as important as the other James, the James and John. I don't know. Anyway, other than that, we have really literally almost no information. Although we know some stuff about him as far as extra biblical history is concerned. He was given the role of pastor of Jerusalem, so he didn't go out beyond that. He stayed in Jerusalem, and he eventually became the pastor there. And historians, Josephus writes about him. He died actually at the age, they believed 94. So he was actually, apart from John, he was probably the oldest apostle, lived the longest apart from John. And he was stoned and then clubbed to death. There you go. Not these guys didn't have very easy deaths by any stretch. Simon the Zealot, also known as Simon the Canaanite, which I would assume that maybe can kind of describe where he came from. I'm not sure necessarily, but the term, he was given that nickname Zealot, which that indicates something about him, right? He was a zealot back in those days, was pretty much like what we would think of as a terrorist. I mean, they took matters into their own hands, social and political change by force, that kind of a thing. And yet here's a guy that had a political view, and yet Jesus transformed him. Jesus called him and changed him from one who was all about changing people from the outside, right? Political and social change. And now he's concerned about allowing God to change people from the inside. Right? So God can work and take these individuals. And so and here's interesting enough, he was known to go to Mauritania, which is on the west coast of Africa. And then after that, he went on to England. So that's pretty interesting enough, kind of close to home here. So that was Simon the Zealot. And then Judas, the son of James. Judas, the son of James, is interesting because he has a lot of names, right? He was called Jude. He was in Mark's gospel, he's called Lebbeus, as well as Thaddeus. This guy I'm not sure if anybody knew what his real name was. He's going around, what's your name? James. Judas. What's your name? Lebbeus. What's your name? Thaddeus. Jude. Anyway. That's really all the information you have about him, that he had a lot of names, but that's pretty much it. A historian does tell us that he went to Armenia, Syria, and Persia, and was martyred and buried in what is now modern-day Iran. So there you have that guy. And of course, then last on our list is Judas Iscariot. And of course, we know it says who also became a traitor. Now, people always question, well, why would Jesus choose someone he knew would be a traitor, that would betray him? And that's a good question. But, first off, we need to understand, the Son of Man had to be betrayed. That was the way it was going to happen, right? It was the plan from the beginning. Now, I will say this, it doesn't let Judas off the hook. He's still responsible for his actions. In other words, God's sovereignty and his providence is never an excuse for our sin, to excuse our sin. In fact, Jesus even said this about Judas in Matthew 26:24. He says, the Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written of him. So it was meant to be. That's the way it was prescribed to happen. But then it says, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. So that's Judas, right? He had all the same advantages and privileges that all the other 11 had. And yet he obviously had a bent. He was not satisfied. He did not fully buy into and believe as the other 11 did. And of course, we know his end, right? He hung himself. And after he hung himself, it says basically the rope broke and he fell down onto the cliffs. And as they would say, his entrails became his outrails, So anyway, I like, though, when you talk about Judas, I like what one theologian said when kind of faced with the same question. Why did Jesus choose Judas Iscariot to be his disciple? And I love this theologian's response. He says, I don't know. He says, but I like that's a good response. But he says, but I have an even harder question. Why did Jesus choose me? See, regardless of why Jesus chose Judas or any other of those men, we have to remember Jesus chose us. He chose us, right? Think about that. That should impact our lives. It should humble us, who we are, that he would choose us. In fact, why did he do it? Well, Ephesians 2:8-9. First of all, it says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. God didn't choose these men. In fact, why did God choose these men? Why did even God choose us? And it reminds me of a passage, 1 Corinthians 1, verse 26, I think it's through 29. And this is not so much my life verse, not that I wanted to be a life verse, but it's just a reality verse kind of a thing that I feel like I portray. He says, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things that are mighty, and the base things of the world and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are. And why? That no flesh should glory in his presence. And so, why did God choose these 12? Why did he choose us? The truth is, because he gets all the glory. He gets all the glory through us. That's what it's all about. God receives the glory, and he's using us. So that's pretty awesome. So let's pray.